Hello and welcome to episode 114 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have some positive news about the Call of Duty League, depending on if you're a fan of the CDL or not. We also have champs being announced this week, when and where the end of season Call of Duty World Championship event will be at the end of the season. We have some roster mania stuff, just a little bite of it, and then we also had CDL Major 3 qualifying matches, the second week of these qualifying matches. This that just wrapped up, an hour or two ago on Sunday. If you're listening on Monday, it happened yesterday. So at least it's current. We're recent. But before we get to any of that, how you doing, Bink?
All right. You said a pretty big week, set the stage for it at least, and got a decent amount to talk about, so might as well hop right in.
Yeah, so the big news of the week is Daniel Say, the Call of Duty League GM, essentially the commissioner of the league, if you want to compare it to traditional sports. He announced earlier this week that the CDL and the CDL team, so Activision Blizzard or Microsoft or however they want to phrase it, the league and the teams had agreed to a new operating agreement that will, what he said, quote, help secure the longevity of competitive Call of Duty. And by doing this, or how they're doing this, is they're eliminating all outstanding entry fees. So back in 2019, when the CDL was first forming, we always heard about those very infamous $25-30 million franchise entry fees. And at the time, even the people that were like very optimistic about Call of Duty esports' future, I think we were all like, how in the hell can you justify spending $25 million on Call of Duty esports to get into a league that we're not even sure will exist in 5 to 10 years? But that's how it worked out. We had 12 owners decide to get in. Unfortunately, or fortunately for them, the pandemic happened, and that paused all of those payments. Some teams, I think it was Jacob Wolf, he reported, maybe it was a year ago or maybe even 2 years now, he reported that CDL teams, sometimes had more than $20 million still that they had to pay in those entry fees. So all of that out the window, and any fees, according to Daniel Say, that were previously collected from the teams, they will be returned in full. And he said that they're permanently removing this, quote, this obligation while injecting capital back into the league. So they're giving the money back to the teams, and hopefully those teams will then decide to spend it on the CDL. Another part is that
let's go point by point here.
Yeah,
so
yeah. If you had any thoughts about this, because obviously this was something we talked about, I think even back when Jacob reported it, and then we had kind of heard rumblings, especially with the Overwatch League doing something similar last year, where they eliminated the entry fees or all of the things that they needed to take from the team. That was kind of pushed out. So what do you think about this point in particular, that teams will now kind of be free of that debt, so to speak?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that I have around this that weren't really addressed in the post. One, I guess not a question, but it is, since you just brought it up and it'll be fresh on listeners' minds, is the comparisons to the Overwatch League and what recently happened with them, where seemingly, obviously it might not be, a one-for-one example or the same scenario, but something similar did happen before, obviously, the Overwatch League shut down and transitioned into the OWCS or something like that this year. So there are questions around what this does really mean for the CDL and its future. Will the CDL still be around? Obviously, there's a lot of talk about longevity and sustainability in this. But, could it be that, the CDL is changed to another name in some form, and competitive Call of Duty is not going anywhere. That's the most important thing. But obviously, maybe there's some rebranding or some restructuring going on here. Obviously, this could lead to expansion as well, which has been a big talking point since then. But the big thing, and partially, what I'm about to say is partially a joke and partially very serious, because and some of our listeners will know how much I despise the people saying like, oh, $300 million league, all this yada yada, when we knew for a fact that teams hadn't paid anywhere close to the full amount to make it a $300 million league. Well, now if all the fees are returned, it's a $0 league, right? But what does that like? How does that work going forward? For because like what do teams have to do? Is it like just an application process to show like you have some plan for competitive Call of Duty going forward? I know something similar with the Valorant partnership system and Riot went down, where obviously I don't know all the details, but based on what we wrote in the articles that we edited when that was going on last year, was that it's like they were basically applying and Riot was giving like a stipend to these teams to fund a team, but they had to show like what their plans were for around content and uh, promoting the league and that sort of thing. So that's the interesting component to me is what does it mean for any potential future teams and how that process works and what's keeping teams in the league technically, right? If they're not, it's just a weird example because like now, are you still an owner of the team if it's not like I guess you're the owner of a team, but you own a free league spot. I don't know. That whole thing is still confusing to me a little bit. And finally, the bigger thing, obviously, there's less situations of this, but for teams, the big one that jumps out to me is like the Immortals group or whatever that had OGLA. They sell the spot to Los Angeles Thieves. How is that situation addressed? Because obviously, Optic, Los Angeles, or Immortals, whatever the parent company is, didn't pay the full spot fee, but they're probably being reimbursed a little bit for whatever the initial investment was at the start of the CDL, and then they still collect the money from 100 Thieves like purchase of their spot, or is Activision paying for LA Thieves acquisition fees and situations like that's up in the air for me. I'm not really sure how all that works. So I just have my head's been spinning over all this, and there's a lot of things that weren't addressed, even though this does seem like on the surface a big W for the CWL, or I already said CWL, CDL. I do have some questions.
Yeah, I think we should work backwards on this because I hadn't really thought about it with something like Immortals. So, like you were saying, to kind of explain it for any new viewers, I think it was Immortals Gaming Club, I think was the parent company. And they owned, at the time, Immortals in the LCS. I think they had a Valorant team, or not a Valorant team, an Overwatch team, which was the LA Valiant. And then they owned Optic Gaming Los Angeles. So they had bought... Infinite was that company that bought the Optic brand from Hex, and it got folded into the Immortals thing. So it was OGLA, but Hex and Scump and like most of the Optic guys were not a part of that. They were part of the Chicago Huntsmen. After I think it was just one CDL season, Immortals, whatever, Infinite, they sell that CDL spot to LA Thieves, or to 100 Thieves, and that creates LA Thieves that we now know. But we've also had we had the Chicago Huntsmen and then Optic Chicago, and then there was NRG owned that spot, and they sold the Optic stuff to Envy, which got folded into the Dallas Empire and all of that, and obviously the Boston Breach came into existence as well after Chicago moved to Texas. Is a very, obviously, we talked about it I think a few months ago now, but if you look back at professional sports leagues when they were first starting up in the first 5-10 years of their existence, you look at like the NBA back in like the 1940s and 50s, like there are so many teams that just like existed for a few seasons and then they're like never to be heard from again. Same with the NFL, Major League Baseball, all of that. And that's kind of what we had with the CDL. I think this is the 5th season in CDL history, and we're still trying to figure it out. We've had so many like teams relocating, rebranding, just ceasing to exist. We'll see what happens with the Gorillas, because that was kind of a saga by itself last season. So I'm interested to see if any of these teams that were involved in kind of a weird ownership change or sale. If they talk about like how it works out, how they're getting reimbursed if Immortals gets money for that. I'm sure that they get reimbursed if they paid, those whatever, like $2 or $3 million up front. But we probably won't hear a ton about it. I don't know if there's a ton of esports executives that are just like, explaining that, oh yeah, we got $3 million back from Activision for, paying in 2019. But the point that you made about, are you really an owner, or like, what is kind of like your role in this league if there is no entry fee? If you look at, I think, most leagues aren't expanding that quickly or that much. Major League Baseball will, I'm sure, expand over the next 5 years. They're obviously the A's are trying to relocate to Las Vegas, and we've seen some pushes for a team in Sacramento or Nashville or North or South Carolina, different places. And I think Major League Soccer is probably the most aggressive in expansion because I think they've expanded by like 10 teams in the last like 5 or 10 years. But they have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars, typically to get into these leagues. So I think, but if the CDL is saying that the 12 teams that are already in the league, they didn't have to pay really anything to get in. Does that same thing apply to future teams? Or is that just for the 12 teams that, were approved back in 2019 or since then through a team sale? A lot of these owners are billionaires or have like some connection to like, this massive amount of wealth. The Gorillas, owned by Kroenke Sports Entertainment. The Kroenke family are, it's one of the richest families in the entire world. Robert Kraft owning the Boston Breach Oxygen Esports. He owns the New England Patriots and the New England Revolution and all of that. So like a lot of these teams are tied to kind of big money, a lot of big names. And that was something that was alleged in Hex and Scump's lawsuit, was that Hex was kind of denied, allegedly, from being a CDO owner because he didn't fit like what, quote unquote, they wanted to a CDL owner to look like, or to to have like their stature, and that to me sounded like we want NFL, NBA, the sports teams owners, because that's easier to sell to advertisers and any potential people that want to get involved in this league. But if the future is those teams don't have to pay anything, I would love to hear what the plan is for expansion, or if there is a plan for CDL expansion. I would say that there should be. There's way too much talent in the league. I'm sure there are teams that are well equipped or more equipped than, say, the Gorillas, who have kind of been, floating out in the ether for the last year because of kind of what's been going on with their parent organization. But I'm sure there are teams like, I think it was Ben Nissim that he tweeted about, like, who do you want to see come in via expansion? And obviously, like, you want teams in the challenger scene to kind of be rewarded for like their loyalty or kind of commitment to competitive Call of Duty. So I think of like Team War, who have been kind of like a part of the challenger scene for years and years. Like the last like 5 years, it feels like every year that they put together a challengers roster. But obviously they were probably never going to get into the CDL because they didn't have like hundreds of millions of dollars to kind of front up there. I think Omit as well. I think Omit won, Challengers Champs last year, and they've consistently fielded Challengers rosters, and obviously there are others as well. And then of course you have other esports organizations that are involved in other competitive scenes. I think of someone like Vitality, which is based in Paris. Like, to have that European representation. Obviously they were in Call of Duty before with Gotaga and Whalers, I believe, back in the day. Somebody like Fnatic, which is based in London, which would fit well because we don't have a London franchise anymore. And that was another part that I thought about was, do you really need the city-based part of it if, nobody really did anything? Like, no one spent that much money now. or once they get it back. No one really spent that much money to get into the CDL. Obviously, they had to pay their players, they had to pay staff. Some teams like Minnesota, I think they built like a practice facility and stuff, but really, like they all kind of got in for a low price. And I'm wondering if you even need the city-based format. Wouldn't it just be better to have 100 Thieves versus LA Thieves? And like 100 Thieves is already tied to Los Angeles, so that doesn't really even matter that much. And same with Optic. Like you don't really need Optic Texas because Optic is already in Dallas. You just have Optic. And same with FaZe. Maybe they wouldn't be tied to Atlanta necessarily. Maybe they would be somewhere else. But I just don't see a real reason to continue to do that. But even if they do, I think there are a lot of possibilities. I'm not sure what you think of that kind of, where expansion goes, if they need the city-based stuff. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a bigger topic around what the future of the league actually is, right? I feel like if it remains the CDL after these changes, that any expansion teams will be geolocated. But if the league was to move on from the quote-unquote CDL, either go back to the CWL or some other name, then it would be a change like that could lead to, getting rid of the geolocated and aspect of these teams.
Yeah. It's a weird thing. I understand the idea behind it is to kind of like get that local support and more grassroots. And we've seen like Minnesota has done like a pretty good job of being like embracing it. Boston, more recently, has really embraced it. But I'm just gonna be honest. Like there are some teams that have just done absolutely nothing to like ingratiate themselves with their local communities, and they're kind of doing a disservice to like the league and the other teams in the league. Toronto has also done, I think, a pretty good job. But like in general, I really don't see a connection between some of these teams and where they're located. And it's not necessarily you have to be like out there shaking hands and kissing babies necessarily to to kind of be a part of the community. But the CDL is not in a place where the NFL like I don't necessarily expect like Browns players to be out and about in Cleveland and being like the faces of the city or anything. Like the NFL is such a big property that they don't need players to really do that, because the Browns themselves, just like the brand by itself, is enough to be like part of Cleveland. That's not the case with the CDL. Like maybe with Optic, because they've been in Texas for a few years and they're such a big brand in esports that maybe they can get by. Same with like 100 Thieves. But like most of these teams need to do more. They need to be a part of their community and like really try to put on events, even if they're smaller events. I'm not saying that everyone has to run like a 6,000, 7,000 seat arena, but like run a LAN event in your local area. I loved what Minnesota did last year, where they brought in a team and they played a series like in a concert hall, like a really small like venue. That's fine. Like that gave their fans something to go to, pay for, which I'm sure the CDL is trying to figure out how to monetize. And it seemed like it was a fun experience. And I think they did it twice. It was one in Minnesota, and I think they did one in Wisconsin, which is good because you kind of branch out from just that city. And Minnesota has, if they want to, they can try to expand across the Midwest. And obviously there are a ton of fans, I'm sure, that would, go along with that. But it's an interesting point. And but yeah, so let's try to move on because the next part is part of the revenue, part of that monetization. Yep. So teams will earn increased revenue tied to the sale of their in-game merchandise, for example, team bundles, and now the Champs bundle as well. Quote, we know how meaningful in-game bundles can be for teams, and we want to make sure they have increased ability to drive their own financial success, end quote. On this point, I just want to say, like, the CDL or not the CDL, Activision, the Call of Duty developers, whether that be Infinity Ward, Sledgehammer, or Treyarch, they need to be better. Like, their designs have been lackluster with some of these bundles and some of the in-game merchandise, which doesn't make people want to buy it. Like, no matter if you're a fan of a team or not, if you have a really ugly skin in the game, it might not be bought, and that is not good for the teams. I actually think the teams should take ownership of this, or in the future they should be the ones designing it, if they want, because I think some of the teams will have a better idea of what their fans will actually want in this, and they'll be able to design better designs than, I'm sure there are a lot of things that those developers and like designers for Infinity Ward, Sledgehammer, Treyarch, I'm sure they have better things to do. A lot of times there are other things to do. But this has been a key part of it. And probably the biggest thing is when these things drop, because we've seen in the past before where these skins don't come out until like too late in the cycle. And then like who cares at that point? Like these need to be day one. Like as soon as Call of Duty drops, the CDL bundle, or maybe not the Champs bundle, but definitely the team bundles need to be on day one, because that's when people are ready to spend their money. They're ready to get into the game. You can't wait until the season starts in January or February or March or anything and then decide to roll it out. It won't work like that, and I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, I think there's been so much talk. I can't honestly remember what's been a rumor and what's actually happened in terms of these bundles, but I feel like for years now there's been discussions over like allowing the franchises to create some of the skins and whatnot. And I feel like one year it might have happened, maybe it was last year, I really don't remember, but I feel like it actually did happen once where they gave the teams, because I feel like I remember Aaron Create from Optic like saying he had some part in it, or I could just be completely misremembering.
I remember something along those lines, yeah.
Regardless of what has and hasn't happened, it has been in discussion over the course of the CDL history now. And now that it is, the CDL essentially saying like you're getting more money from it, the way that the CDL Activision could make more money from the bundles while also giving the teams an increased slice of the pie is by allowing them to have more say in the design. Because like you said, if they release them late or they release lackluster designs, nobody's going to buy them, then the teams and Activision aren't making the money. So I do agree that that is definitely part of it. But it's on surface level, it seems like a W. More teams getting more money from it, but the aspect of purchasing skins and bundles in Call of Duty has always been not, at least from an esports perspective, it hasn't been a main priority. Like you look at these other games like Valorant, CSGO, even League of Legends, stuff like that. It feels like it's more prominent than, especially, CODs. I know Valorant and CS is mostly first person as well, but the thing a lot of people say is you're buying these suits and stuff, and you can't even see it unless you're going to a third person mode or whatever. You see the camo on the gun, and that's it. Unless you're playing against somebody, and then I always joke when we were playing like GVs and competitive COD and stuff. I would love playing the people in Optic uniforms because they're wearing these bright neon green suits and these environments that it sticks out like a sore thumb, and I was a huge fan when people would wear that stuff against me. But nonetheless, I think this is on the surface a W for the league and the teams involved. But I do agree with your points that there has to be some urgency in terms of getting the stuff out so you can make money sooner, and getting the teams involved, just regardless of what has and hasn't happened in the past in terms of that. So that the designs are potentially more in line with what the fans want, and then if the fans want them more and they make more money, it's win-win for everybody.
Yeah. CSGO is probably the greatest example of this because the stickers have been such a major success, especially like financially for teams, and they get a cut. The players themselves, they had like the signature, and I think the CDL does that for like champs, but I think that's it. Which is a missed opportunity again because that's only like a really small part of the season, and it should just be you start the season and everything's there. It really helps out. The third point was increased subsidy events or event subsidy amounts for the CDL teams that want to organize these live LAN events, such as majors, opens, and champs. So this is an interesting point, obviously, because it's Carolina. They announced a week ago or 2 weeks ago now that they're not going to be hosting the fourth major in Charlotte as planned, and that event will now be in Burbank and won't have fans. This has become kind of a yearly tradition with CDL teams. New York did it last year. Most memorably, it ended up that land ended up being in Columbus with no fans. I think this is all well and good, but we'll see what happens, because I know that the big point has been that these events are not money making events, that teams lose money on them. And I'm interested to see if that will change at all. Like, how much more money will it be, and like, will that actually make a discernible difference between the teams that have already been trying to host events, Boston, Toronto. We'll get to it, but now Optic, or yeah, I think Optic is hosting this. Who else has been hosting events? Minnesota, I think, has hosted at least one or two. Florida or Miami just hosted one this season. So like, we're seeing some teams, Boston and Toronto, have, I think, been at like the top in terms of like almost every year they're on top of it. They really want to host an event. But a team like FaZe in Atlanta, one of the bigger cities in the United States, especially in the South, they have not hosted a CDL event since like February 2020, and I'm not sure exactly even if that was FaZe hosting it or if that was the CDL hosting it in Atlanta. But it's been at least 4 years since we've had an event where the best team historically in CDL history is located. LA has really only had champs for the last 4 years. That was the last CDL home series event before the pandemic. I don't think there's been one in Seattle, so the last event would have been like CWO Seattle in 2019. So like, there are a bunch of missed opportunities, I would say, with this. Do you think it'll make a difference, or are you kind of a wait and see on this?
Definitely wait and see. I mean, that's what my huge takeaways from all of these points really is, that on the surface they seem like W's, but then there's questions in terms of the finer details around these statements. So like you said, for this one, it's really a question of how much money is what's going to these teams to try and make it more feasible to run these events. It in my book, at least, it feels like it has to be, the bare minimum is that the money has to equal the amount to prevent whatever is causing these last few examples of teams not being able to host their events. It has to make up that difference, So let's just, for a number's sake, without knowing what the numbers is, if it was like $100,000 that Carolina needed to run this last event, they weren't able to get it, then that's what the minimum should be going to these teams in an effort to maybe like, okay, they need this. That's what we, Activision, as a multi-billion-dollar company or whatever it is, they can, throw them a couple pennies in terms of what they make, and these teams are able to host the event. So but at the end of the day, it is important, like you said, to mention that the monetization of these events in terms of profitability, making money back for the league and the teams, that's always been a tricky part of it, and it's always, from what we've heard at least, they're huge losses of money in terms of, you just think about getting all that equipment in there. Obviously, it's different now compared to hosting an open event back in the MLG days, where you had to have a bunch of setups. Now, technically, you only have to have 8 or 2 setups for one for each team, so 8 PCs and all that stuff. But production, and I don't even want to start to think about how much these events really cost, because I honestly have no idea. I just know it has to be a lot of money. So, on the surface, it's great that this is seemingly happening, but it has to just be in a way that we don't see any further cancellation of events, right? So if next year we have, they're telling us we're giving these teams to host events, and somebody else backs out at the last minute next year, then obviously there's something going wrong with this part of the changes for the following year. So that's where my head's at least with this point of the change.
Microsoft is so they're in 2023 their revenue was $211.9 billion. Their net income was $73.4 billion. This is a rounding error if they put on event per team. If they put on 12 events per year, it's a rounding error for Microsoft. They don't recognize that they have lost like any of this money in the end. And I think with Microsoft now being a part of it, it should make it easier. Like I think when Call of Duty's their contract with Sony and PlayStation is up, like it would just make sense to kind of like be, part of like Xbox and, or just PC in general. I don't think it needs to be exclusive or anything, but just kind of like open up that kind of like I know that people have said like running these events, especially the challengers, like open bracket events with the computers is like it's kind of a pain in the ass, because before it was you buy some PS4s or PS5s, you put them down and like people just play on them. But now like you actually have to have computers brought in, and obviously there are so many problems with, even on the main stage that we have problems with these computers. So maybe it'll change with Microsoft and them, really taking ownership of the CDL. But yeah, it's an interesting point, but I'm gonna be like you, and I'm gonna wait and see what teams actually do, and if this actually sways them one way or the other. The last point was that teams will receive a 2-year minimum guarantee of revenue so they can continue investing into the Call of Duty League with more peace of mind. So I'm assuming that this is 2 years following this season, so two
Yeah.
more seasons of the CDL, which that means the clock is ticking. 2 years after this one, so 2.5, let's say, that's what you have left of the CDL, or to, not necessarily, but to prove that this is something that should be, keep worth keeping around. If this, Activision, or I guess Microsoft now, if they decide in, those 2 years that, or by the end of those 2 years that this isn't worth it, it's not worth our time, it's not worth our money, etc. Like I think then you could pull the plug, but they still own Call of Duty. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure exactly what that even means. Maybe it would just be a significant change to what Call of Duty esports has been for the last 5 years. Of course, Microsoft also owns Halo. Halo runs the Halo World Championship, which is more closely related to like the CWL before the CDL, where they have partner teams. Those are actual esports organizations, not franchise teams. I think they have like 16. They have a few like in North America and Europe as well. So like it feels like more of the CWL, and I think they've, from what I can gather, on the peripheral, like it seems like they've done a pretty good job with it. Granted, the Call of Duty is much, much, much bigger than Halo, and I think there's a lot more long term potential for it. But 2 years is 2 years, and I think that should be the goal in mind, that in these next 2 years, 2.5 years, the CDL teams, and the CDL and Microsoft, they have to really commit to making this work, or it's just going to be like the last 5 years where we get these promises and we say, well, that sounds good, like we might be able to do something with that, and then it turns out to not be as great as we once thought. I think that's kind of been the CDL to this point, is like, there's definitely potential there. It's fun while it lasts. The matches I think are usually pretty fun. The tournaments are pretty fun. But in the end, it's kind of like a little bit unsatisfying at times, because of the stuff that's happening on the edges, like, the business side of it, and, obviously teams moving around and all that stuff. So hopefully 2 years of guaranteed revenue will help these teams, or at least, kind of soothe some of the concerns that they might have. What are your thoughts on this? Because it feels like the clock may be beginning to tick on the CDL, and in its current format, at least.
I honestly didn't think about it from that perspective. more so was thinking that this is, again, this is one where it seems on the surface like a good thing, but we don't know the details, right? Because like technically a minimum 2 year guarantee, they could just give each team $50 for
Yeah.
2 years and say this is your guarantee, right? So we don't know the details of how much money this is, how substantial it is, but in my mind, I took this as it's gonna be effectively like a small injection to help with like player salaries and stuff like that. Now, we've already seen in recent years the move to try and, at least from the outside looking in, it seems like there's been a push to try and lower salaries for these players from the, pre-COVID or
Yeah.
right during the COVID era, point where they were getting exorbitantly high. Again, reportedly, we don't know the figures for sure, but that's where I was thinking of this. Like, I don't think it's going to be any like game breaking uh or game changing amount of money where like we see Vegas Legion all of a sudden being able to give 4 players $1 million contracts, right? Like, but this could be something that allows a team like Vegas Legion to spend a little bit more money on their roster than potentially they previously did. So I wasn't really thinking about it from like a, you got 2 years to prove it sort of deal. I can kind of see where your head's at from that point of view. But I was more just thinking like this, especially because it was the last point to me. It was kind of just like, this is they're throwing this out there to be like, yeah, we're gonna give you guys a little bit of guaranteed cash, effectively, kind of like we were talking with the Riot example for Valorant earlier. It's kind of like a stipend for some of these teams to try and make something happen there. And but yeah, we don't know what the total money injection is or how much is really going to these teams' way. So can't say much about what this means beyond that without knowing that for sure. But I guess you can look at it either way. After what you said there, you can either look at this as it's a good thing that teams are potentially getting a little bit of money, and at the same time, it could be a sign that the writing's on the wall. Which I guess even if it's a 2 year clock, the writing was seemingly on the wall heading into this season. So it's been delayed a little bit at the worst if you're a pessimistic fan. But yeah,
It felt
definitely a go ahead.
it felt like, I talked about it before. It felt like the CDL was coming to an end like after this season,
Yeah,
because everything that we had heard and like what, it felt like the league is kind of at odds with the teams, or at least some of the teams that are very publicly against, going for the YouTube cash play. Like, let's be exclusive to YouTube, and there was at least pushback from two teams, and two of the three most popular teams being Optic and LAT. Those teams or their owners were against going and being exclusive to YouTube again, because they didn't feel like it was worth it. That is something that a league does, in my opinion, when they're kind of desperate for revenue or just kind of like any kind of money. And that's what it felt like at least this year. It felt like the CDL was kind of nearing its natural conclusion, especially after we saw what happened with the Overwatch League, where the owners decided that they'd rather have $6 million of guaranteed revenue by terminating the operating agreement than to continue on. It seems like this is, you know, not the exact opposite, but definitely the CDL owners or Activision saying we believe in the CDL more than we did the Overwatch League, probably rightfully so, in my opinion. But we'll see what happens. I think that Activision has done a really poor job at kind of like setting all of this up. Not necessarily this specific instance, but just over the last 5 years, like some empty promises definitely haven't really reached the potential that they probably should have in these last 5 years, COVID notwithstanding. So we'll see what happens. It's always kind of a wait and see with the CDO anyway. But at least we're guaranteed to have more CDO action past this season, which definitely is kind of like a weight lifted off of, I'm sure, some people's shoulders that this isn't the end of the CDL, or maybe it's the worst thing in the world, depending on who you are and what you wanted out of Call of Duty esports. But yeah, let's wrap our conversation on that there, and let's talk about champs, because this was just a few days after that announcement. The CDL had another announcement that the 2024 Call of Duty League Championship is going to happen July 18th, from July 18th to July 21st in Texas, Allen, Texas, which is part of like the Dallas-Fort Worth area as far as I know. And it'll be at the Credit Union of Texas Events Center. So this is kind of one of those things, every year we're kind of like, all right, when is champs? Where is champs? And again, that's one of the wait and see things. We usually get it tipped off, 2 or 3 months beforehand, and things kind of pick up from there. We're about 3 months away now until champs. And now we know that it will be in Optics backyard, and that it'll be the July 18th to the 21st, a Thursday through Sunday event. Or 8 teams will be at the event, presumably. Yeah, I don't think that the prize pool was announced, but they did announce that Challengers Finals will also be happening at Champs with 16 teams, 10 through the Challengers point system, and then 6 through the Last Chance qualifiers. And they'll play the Challengers Grand Finals on the main stage on Championship Sunday before the Champs Grand Finals. So your thoughts on this, because I know some people are kind of like a little back and forth on like, it's optics, backyard, it's whatever, but like, I, at least in my opinion, every event is kind of an optics backyard, because that's kind of how it goes.
That's the counterpoint there. The other thing is Optic or Envy or whatever you want to consider. They own the esports stadium in Arlington. So if it was technically a quote unquote home event, it would be there instead of it wherever this other place is. Now, I don't know how far away this place is from Optic, but you can also make the argument that a lot of the team's players, even though we've had these geolocation teams and whatnot, there have been a lot of teams housed and competing in these online matches from Texas over the last couple of years. So you could argue, especially in a year where it's seemingly about trying to save money and make money back and give money back, all that sort of thing, that especially if a lot of players are still in Texas, this could be the cheapest route for this event in terms of paying for players to get to the event and whatnot and all that. So I don't really have a problem with it. I did see that initial sort of discourse there about it being a quote unquote optic home event and whatnot, and I do think that is a solid point, referencing what you mentioned about Optic, always the most popular team in any event, no matter where it's located, is seemingly going to be Optic favored, unless it's a rare situation where it's an EU based event and it's Optic versus an EU team. But even then, it might be closer to a 50-50 split than like 90-10 for Optic. So yeah, I think honestly this might be the earliest we've gotten champs information in the season. Like, I wasn't expecting it this early at all. I would have probably, maybe at Major 3 or after Major 3 they would have announced it if you had to ask me before this. But so I was pleasantly surprised and kind of caught off guard, to be honest, that they announced it. But it does mean now, where we don't know what's going on with the off season, if this is happening end of July, we could be in for another torturously long off season, which we'll obviously have to cross that bridge when we get there, and hopefully it's not too long. But that is something else to consider now that we know when champs is happening.
So I guess this champs announcement and last year's champs announcement were almost identical, like almost the exact same time of the year. But last year's champs was a month earlier than this year's, so there was only less than 2 months from that announcement to actual championship weekend. We have 3 months from this one, so that is, even though it's the same time, like it is later in the season. It was later in the season last year than it is this year, which is a good thing. It's good to have plans. Like, people, if they're gonna fly out to, and I looked it up, Allen, Texas is like 45 miles away from Dallas, or like from the Arlington esports stadium and all that stuff. So like that is not like a like a a real like quick simple drive like down the road. Like it's a little bit of a drive depending on if you're used to that sort of thing. But still, like if you're gonna fly out to Texas and attend champs. Teams especially need to figure out their travel arrangements to make sure that they're able to like get hotels, get a flight out to all of their staff and all of that. It's good to have extra time on this, and I'm glad that we're getting it at least 3 months ahead of when the actual event will be. I'm excited. I don't buy into the whole backyard thing because like you're going to be in someone's backyard almost all the time anyway. If you're running one of these events, if you're running in LA, like you could just argue that that's Gorilla's country actually, because the Gorillas have owned LA for the better part of 5 years. LAT really hasn't done a whole lot of that, but if you want to say any of these cities, except if you're going to a city like Chicago where they don't have a team, but Minnesota technically is the only Midwest team. So at that point you could say that. But Optic in general is the most popular team, and they have the loudest fans, or the most fans necessarily. They make the loudest noise, and that doesn't mean anything. I saw people talking about it on Twitter. It's like Optic has won one Call of Duty World Championship. They have been the most popular team every single year, and they've only won one. It does not matter that it's in Texas or close to Optic at all. Like it makes it more convenient for them, but half the league lives in Texas, so it makes it more convenient for pretty much half the league anyway. So I don't think it really matters, but it's a good thing that Challengers is also coming back to Champs, and that they'll get that main stage shine before Championship Sunday. That's always kind of cool to see the teams and what they're able to do on such a big stage, and hopefully we'll see players and teams that get bumped up to the CDL that win that event, like we saw from this past year. But yeah, that about does it for the the preamble part of the show. We spent about 45-50 minutes talking about that, but it is literally the future of the CDL that we were talking about. If things didn't go that way, we might be talking about kind of the downfall of the CDL and where we go from here. But that means that the Ego Chall Podcast will probably be continuing on for at least a few more years. Maybe the CDL can make us the official podcast. We definitely talk so glowingly about the league on a consistent basis.
I think we might have some competition there too.
I don't know any popular CDL podcasts, so we're really the only one. Let's get into these matches. We'll more quickly run through them. Some of these were kind of expected, some of the results, but we had the second week of the Major 3 qualifying matches. All of these online. I think we had 9 matches in total this week. 3 on Friday, 3 on Saturday, and 3 on Sunday. Starting with Friday, April 19th. I think it can't be the upset of the weekend, but it's at least in the top 2. Carolina versus New York. We both picked the Subliners to win this. Of course, why would we not? And we were wrong, not because we're dumb. I think we're very smart people, but New York had one of their worst weekends, in years. Really their worst weekend since Major 1. And they lose this opening match to Carolina 3-2. And not only 3-2 in just like a general way. Carolina, who we've talked so much, I wrote them off last week. They must have heard me. Clayster was watching. They had very rarely been able to win S&D. It was something that we talked about quite a bit. They end up beating New York, the defending world champions, twice in S&D in this series to win the match 3-2. Your thoughts on a horrible way to start the week for the New York Subliners?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I did bring up when we were doing our predictions last episode. I said I was going with New York, but Carolina has upset them before, so it wasn't totally out of the realm of possibility in my eyes, even though recent history suggested that New York was favored. But this was a very big series for Glenn, who ended up setting the new record for most kills in a series for CDL and MW3 at 115, and he did it by, I think you dropped 12 in both S&Ds, and he had a 1v3 in the last round of the game 5 to close it out in the game-winning round. So, it was a really strong performance out of Gwen, and I mean, if that's what some of these, non-top 4 teams are going to have to do to beat the top 4 teams, then I'm here for it, but it also, if you aren't getting a superstar, potentially record-setting performance out of a player, if that's what it takes to beat one of these top 4 teams, it might be a bit of a stretch in terms of how frequently we see this. But it's a good sign for Carolina at least, and obviously the rest of the team statistically didn't have the strongest numbers, but it's also kind of hard to post strong slaying numbers when someone on your team has so many kills. So it's just a win that Carolina will definitely take. And, the bigger thing around, we'll talk more about Carolina when we get to their second match of the week too, is that they're seemingly now all in the same area, competing from an apartment or a quote-unquote headquarters facility, even though I don't think it's an actual facility. And is that like the change that finally unlocks this Carolina team and allows them to, be more competitive? Because we've seen it on LAN, like glimpses of what this team can do. It just seemed like in the online matches they struggle, and that put them on the back foot heading into some of these lands. So we'll have to see now that they're all together in the same spot if this unlocks like the next level of the squad.
Yeah. So I almost said Hydra. Gwen dropped 32 in map 1, 30 in map 3, 29 in map 4. And then obviously, like you said, 12 in map 2 S&D, 12 in map 5 S&D. He dropped a 1.47 KD. He had over 20,000 damage. He's just a ridiculous player. I know he kind of got clowned a little bit a few weeks ago after they lost to Vegas, and he said something along the lines like, "Can't believe I lost to these bums," or whatever he said. And, Theory, got butthurt about it. I kind of believe Gwen when he said, like, now that we've seen this, and he's been really good all season.
Yeah.
Like, he's definitely the rookie of the year, like, front runner for me at least. Even though Carolina's been pretty lackluster. But, like, for this to happen against, Hydra had a good series statistically. Kismet had a good series statistically, and it still didn't matter. Gwen was able to do pretty much whatever he wanted on the map, and I just came away so impressed with this series from Gwen. So congrats to Carolina. We will talk about them in just a little bit again. But yeah, so the next two matches were kind of like whatever. Seattle versus Optic and Miami versus Toronto. We both picked Optic and Toronto. Both of those teams won. Optic beat the Surge 3-0. Nothing, really to talk about. Like, it was a close series, but that's that's kind of how it goes. It was a 35-point win in Hardpoint. A round 11 S&D win for Optic and on High Rise, which is always good. Not necessarily good for Seattle, which has been an S&D heavy team, and then a 3-0 Control win for Optic. Any thoughts on this series in general?
I think this is what you expected. Especially those first two maps were probably a little closer than some fans might have liked, but I think they were going through on the broadcast and saying Optic's records on these maps, and obviously 6 stars a new map. But I don't believe they had played a lot of High Rise Search or Karachi Control. And I remember last episode, or maybe it was 2 episodes ago, when we were talking about like the number of maps that teams had played on the maps that were removed for the ones that were replaced. Optic had played a lot, so it seems to me like Optic was potentially taking the opportunity here to test some maps out. So that could obviously play a factor in how close the maps were, but end of the day, Optic gets a 3-0 win. Greenwall shouldn't have anything to complain about from that one.
Next match was Toronto versus Miami. Toronto ends up winning this series, but it was kind of interesting. Obviously, Miami, they win this opening hard point, 250 to 163 on Vista. And then they go to round 11, Karachi S&D in game 2. Toronto ends up taking that map, and Toronto ends up winning control and hardpoint, even though the hardpoint was, decently close as well. I mean, it was a good showing from Miami, better than expected, and that's really all you can ask. I'm not thinking that Miami's going to beat Toronto, even if Toronto hasn't looked necessarily as good as they did earlier in the season. But and the Heretics have kind of been dealing with these mini roster changes over the past month or two, and we're still kind of seeing what Real can do with the Heretics. Any lasting impressions from this match?
I think it's, it is interesting that Miami was able to take a win, but it's also on one of the new hardpoint maps. So obviously both teams are trying to get a feel for them and that sort of thing. So that is interesting to note. And obviously that map too, like you mentioned, was pretty obviously all of these maps were pretty close outside of the control. But yeah, I mean Miami obviously before this one they beat Boston. And that was one where they won some searches, but they won Vista Hardpoint in that match against Boston. So they should be 2-0 on Vista Hardpoint now. It could be, you know, maybe that's a team that sees a little bit of help from these map changes. But now I'm looking at their next match, and I already am backtracking on what I said. So up to this point, though, they were looking good on Vista Hardpoint, and you could maybe argue what I was just saying, that the map changes were helping them. But that will in about 5 minutes, you'll understand why I'm backpedaling a little bit, because I just saw what happened in their next match.
Yeah, so Friday night, Miami felt really good about their Vista Hardpoint. By Saturday night, they did not feel nearly as good. They lost 250 to 164 on Vista Hardpoint to open the series against LAT to start on Saturday.
I will say it seems a little, we're making it seem like they got 10-point clubbed or something.
Yeah.
But so we're being a little dramatic, but
But they're not undefeated, so they
Yeah.
they don't have that to hang their hat on anymore. But they did win round 11 6-star S&D to tie the series against LAT. LAT wins the control. Rio Hardpoint, which has been the bane of Miami's existence, it seems, since it came into the map pool. They win that map by 101 points to force a game 5. And unfortunately, for Heretics, they lose Invasion Search game 5, 6-4. Kremp drops 11 in that map to take the series 3-2 for LAT. This is a pretty back and forth series. Miami, we're still, like I said, trying to figure out what they are, because they started the season, surprisingly well, and then have been kind of on a downward trajectory since then. They've had, they've been, it seems, more competitive lately. Obviously, Boston is not, the best team or anything, and LAT has been inconsistent as well. But what did you think of this match and LAT's win to start 2-0 on the season, or on this qualifying stretch?
That's just what I remember breaking it down last episode, not really being super confident in picking either of these teams, but I just went with the mindset of LAT beat Vegas last week, Miami beat Boston that week. Both those were 3-2 wins. I view Vegas as a better team than Boston, so I put a little more credit on, or more stock into, LAT's win than Miami's, and that's where I went with LAT over Miami. But obviously these teams are close. A tough series here that just ended up going LAT's way. But we see some of the new maps in there, and Vista Hardpoint, 6-star search. So teams are still feeling them out, getting a lay of the land in terms of these new environments and whatnot. So I thought Ghosty played well. Obviously, he had that 1v3 he had in the map 5 was pretty nutty, and in my eyes it was the game winning play. Obviously, it wasn't in the final round, but it kind of in my eyes at least pushed LAT to the brink there to allow them to close it out. And honestly, if Miami didn't pull off the 2-5 comeback in map 2, this could have technically been a 3-0. So pretty good performance out of LAT here.
So after last week, Vegas, they lost to or not Boston. They lost to Miami, or was it? No, who?
They lost to
LAT.
LAT.
So they lost to LAT last week, and that was a surprising loss. We talked about it if you want to listen back to it on the last episode. It turns out that was a pretty crucial loss for Vegas. It ends up being the last match for Purge, who got benched or released. He got replaced, regardless, by ASIM. So ASIM, who controversially was released from Boston after Major 2, along with Slasher, ASIM finds himself on the Vegas Legion. I'm not sure exactly how many CDL teams this is for him, but
Minnesota, New York, Boston, Vegas. That's in one,
LAG.
I feel like. LAG, at least 5.
Yeah. So he's almost half the league so far. Was he on Royal Ravens? He was London.
He was.
So half the league. So congratulations to him. His jersey collection is crazy. But it was not a good series to debut for ASIM. Again, we talked about it. It's the backup quarterback, rookie quarterback thing. You don't do this to a player. He had to go up against Optic in his first match. And it did not necessarily go super well for him. He had a .64 KD. Vegas gets 3-0'd, despite it kind of being a close series in terms of like individual map scores. But yeah, 3-0 for Optic. What do you think about Purge being replaced here by ASIM? Obviously, we talked about how ASIM probably didn't get a fair shake with Boston. I think that could probably be the case for a few of the teams that he's been on and then been benched or released in his career. But Purge, he was really criticized earlier in the season when he was not performing very well at all. They make a role swap when they bring in Geo. He moves. I think Purge moved to an SMG role, or primarily SMG. And Vegas did have one of their best qualifying stretches in franchise history last time out. So what do you think about Purge being replaced by ASIM here?
Yeah, obviously I've sung ASIM's praises before, so I really like the move, and I do think, like you said, Purge notably struggled statistically on multiple occasions this year. So I think it's a case. Obviously, there's some talent there. I know there was the clip earlier in the season where Clay was saying that he even potentially wanted the team with Purge before they got Gwen, and Purge kind of said like, no, I don't want to play with Clay or whatever, and that was obviously funny. But obviously, that means there is talent there that's being recognized by multiple people. It's not just a case of like Vegas gave this kid a chance and it didn't work out. But he just maybe needs a little more time in Challenger, so he's going to go back in the pit now, and I think he's on FC Black, so he's got a good shot to showcase what he's capable of on a really good team there. But for ASIM, this is, we've talked so much now at this point about the league being like top 4 and then everybody else. Realistically, I mean, obviously I know New York struggled this past week, but realistically the top 4 teams shouldn't be making any roster changes the rest of this year. I'd be very surprised if they were. So ASIM going from Boston, who's at the very bottom, is getting a chance to, potentially go on one of the best teams that theoretically could make a change this year, right? So he's getting a really good opportunity here. If things don't work out, I'm really going to have to, sit back and reevaluate what's going on, but I do like the fit. I think him and Attach should really work well together from a communication standpoint. We've seen multiple times on different teams and stuff that seems to be a strength for them in particular. And you have a young gun still in Geo, and obviously Nero. We've talked about him since the days on Boston, where he always just has that ability to light the match, and just he can give you 35 kills like nothing. And he might struggle in other maps, but it seems like that potential is there, where he can just out of nowhere go off and take over a map. So I really like the move, and I think long term it could be a good one for Vegas. But do I think it's gonna push them into the top 4 or anything? Obviously, it's tough to say because we'll have to see more from them. But I do think this is a move that, if it goes well, it should solidify them as like that 5th, 6th team just outside of the top 4.
Yeah, I think this is the best roster that Vegas has had, or the Legion have had probably in their franchise's history. Like, the Standy, Clayster, Temp, TJ roster was like solid, and they were very, very close to making champs last year. But I think like the talent on this team is like really high. Obviously, Attach, I think he's probably one of the best AR players in the entire league. So like that really helps in general. And Gio has shown a lot so far this season as a rookie. He's one of the top rookies this season. And we'll see with Asim. Like he really hasn't gotten like an extended period of time with the team. So maybe if Vegas can stick with him for obviously the rest of the Major 3 qualifiers and Major 3, and then maybe actually make it to Major 4. At that point, we can really give like a good idea of like, or get a good idea of what he's able to do in this type of roster. But obviously not a great first impression, but that's to be expected considering how good Optic is. But you were saying that, the top 4 teams aren't going to be making roster changes. I wouldn't take it as a lock right now. I'd say like the top 3 probably are not making roster changes, but the 4th team, I just think this is a week from hell for the New York Subliners. About as bad of a week in terms of results as you can get. I think even worse than the Major, just simply like from the level of competition that they were playing. So obviously we talked about to open the week, New York lost 3-2 to the Carolina Royal Ravens. Carolina has been one of like the bottom 4 teams all season long. And here, the final match on Saturday, New York played the Seattle Surge. Seattle, basically since Illy's departure or benching or whatever, after Major 1 was that, they have looked pretty lackluster, to say the least. That didn't really matter too much on Saturday. New York loses the series 3-1. Skies, this series had a 1.44 KD, and they still lost. Sib probably had his worst series to date, at least with New York. Dropped a 0.7. But just a really, really bad series. Hydra had 43 kills in map 4. Skies had 32, and it still wasn't enough. They lose 3 of the 4 maps. They lose all of the respawns to Seattle, which is like, that's shocking. For Seattle to win even more than 1 respawn probably would be shocking. Your thoughts on this? I'm not saying that they're gonna make a roster change. I'm just saying it's not as a guaranteed lock as it would have been before this week, in my opinion.
Yeah, I still don't think they do, but yeah, end of the day, it's a pretty bad week for New York, all things considered. It's definitely 2 matches. You expect them to win, and if you did, for whatever reason, think they were maybe going to go 1-1, you're probably more leaning towards thinking they lose to Carolina over Seattle just because of that, previous history with Carolina already beating New York and Seattle more recently making a roster change. So I really don't know what to make of the New York last couple matches. Obviously, not exactly an ideal scenario out of them, and they're just making it harder for them when it comes to Major 3. And things don't necessarily get easier for them next week. So it might be a couple weeks now before we really get to see what's truly going on for New York, because it's very possible they're 1-3 after their 1 match to end next week, and then they'll have 3 matches left, and you probably have to go 4-3 to feel comfortable about being in the top 8 for winners bracket. Obviously we had some weird tiebreakers and stuff last time.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't one of the teams make it 2-5?
I think that was the time before, but yeah, I think LAG one time made it with 2-5. But yeah, if you go 3-4, I think you're almost guaranteed a spot.
No, yeah, it was Miami went 2-5, and they were tied with Carolina last time, and Miami got in. Major 1. Major 1 LAG went 2-5. They were tied with LAT, and LAG got the last spot. So yeah, there's you're technically, it's not all doom and gloom for New York, but obviously they are definitely, these two losses are ones you expect them to win, and this could make it a little tougher for them to start in the winners bracket in Major 3, and obviously heading into that land, that's probably top priority for them. So they're putting their backs against the wall. We'll have to see how they're able to respond.
Yeah, and they lost to two teams that were more likely to go 2-5 and like be in those
Yep.
tiebreakers than if they had lost to say Optic and FaZe this week.
Yep.
But yeah, it's obviously a horrible week for New York, but they do have time to turn it around. They're only 3 matches in to the 7-game or 7-match swing of qualifiers, so they have time. Sunday, April 21st, today, as we're recording this, we had the final 3 matches for this week. Carolina versus LAG, Boston versus Minnesota, and Toronto versus Atlanta. Obviously, like the main event was the last one because we were really expecting it, but I really thought the first 2 matches were pretty entertaining. I wasn't sure exactly what to make of Carolina versus LAG, despite Carolina winning that opening match against New York. LAG is kind of always like a little bit of a wild card, just like what team is actually going to show up. It turns out that this was online LAG. They were definitely online. They got swept in the series. It was kind of a tight series individually, but 3-0 for Carolina. They go 2-0 on the week, which is, it's got to feel really good for them. Do you think this is like something to actually build on, or should we not have higher expectations for Carolina moving forward?
No, I'm excited to see what Carolina is capable of now, especially online environment in the same facility, apartment, whatever it is. Um, I think this clearly gives them the best opportunity to be really more competitive in these matches, and if that's what it takes to bring out the best in them, then I'm here for it. So I'm excited to see what they do. Obviously, they have the win against New York is more meaningful than the win against LAG in probably just about everybody's eyes. But I'm excited to see what they can do against all these other teams that they're going to be playing now in the qualifiers, see if this is really what unlocks them going forward and allows them to potentially, get into that conversation of being that team like just below the top 4. I feel like that's a realistic expectation for them if they keep on improving.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what every team should be striving for outside of Optic, New York, Toronto, and
Yes,
Atlanta. Like 5th is realistic for any of those teams right now, or at least 6th.
absolutely. Yep.
But yeah, particularly Carolina, because they have been at least a lot better recently. And they're not nearly as dysfunctional as some of those other teams that have been like really just trying to find something with these new rosters. So there's an open door for them. Some of the 2 of those teams that are a little more dysfunctional than the rest, Boston versus Minnesota. Boston has definitely been, I think, the most dysfunctional so far this season. But Minnesota, they're still trying to figure out their new roster, and they went up against each other today. It was a nearly a reverse sweep for Boston, but it ends up being a round 11 win for the Minnesota Rocker. There's no way that Accuracy's teams are losing round 11s. The Iceman does not lose those, and Minnesota ends up winning their first match of the Major 3 qualifiers. They're now 1-2. Boston, they only had 1 match this week. They dropped to 0-2 after dropping a match last week as well. Any thoughts on this? Because first win for the gunless and standy version of the Minnesota Rocker. And again, obviously Boston, because of how dysfunctional and how public that has been. I think there are definitely people that are going to relish in this kind of loss, for particularly someone like Snoopy and the Boston Breach.
Yeah, I you know, I I really, this is one that's a little, we were tossing back and forth, didn't know which way to go from a prediction standpoint, and obviously game 5 round 11 is a little indicative of that. But I'm trying to just think here, like, even looking at this for Minnesota, like the fact that one of the searches was a 6-0 and the other is around 11, like that doesn't really add up to me. Like, I guess you could just say Minnesota is a lot better at invasion search than 6-star, and 6-star is a new map, but end of the day, it is serious. Boston could have literally one round away from a reverse sweep, and we're talking completely different narrative here. And Snoopy getting a win, and
That's how it
proving people
goes.
wrong. So yeah, it's definitely a weird one, and I'm not really sold on either team at this point.
No.
But Lynn's had a strong performance, 97 kills to lead the way, 1.2 KD. Um, but yeah, I think gonna need to see more from both of these teams still before I really have a good feel for the new rosters, how they're doing. But obviously, Minnesota getting that win is a step in the right direction for them.
That's kind of how the teams near the bottom have to really work
Yeah.
anyway to win those matches against other bottom 8 teams and hopefully just kind of rack up as many as possible. So this is a good first step for Minnesota. And like you said, for Boston, it's a completely different narrative if one round goes differently for the Breach and they win that game 5, round 11. But that's how it goes. That's just kind of like Call of Duty in a nutshell. One round can change pretty much everything. So, but they've only played 2 matches so far. Like I said with I think it was New York. Boston still Boston still got time to figure it out. Maybe get to 2-5 or maybe even 3-4, and then we'll see what happens at the major. It's kind of anybody's ball game at this point. There's a lot of competition in the bottom 4, and we'll see what happens. But finally, we had the grand finale of the weekend, but it was not as competitive as you would likely imagine. Atlanta FaZe, Toronto Ultra, the 2 teams that competed against each other in the Major 1 Grand Finals. That Toronto won. Toronto also beat FaZe in the winners finals of Major 1. But this was not competitive at all. This was more resembling what happened to Toronto in the grand finals of last year's champs against New York. Just getting bludgeoned by a seemingly superior opponent. FaZe 250 to 127 on hardpoint, 6-1 search, 3-1 control. None of these maps were close. The stats tell the tale as well. Celium 1.83 KD in this series. Abizi and Simp both had 1.3s or better. Draza, a lowly 1.16 KD. 3 of the players on Ultra had a 0.66 or below, and Scrappy was the only player to exceed 10,000 damage or have above a 0.66 KD. So this was an ass kicking of unexpected origin. I would not I wasn't thinking FaZe would I picked Toronto, but I want to clear it up that I said, if you want to go back, you can listen to it, or you could watch it on YouTube. I said that I just wanted to be different, which is kind of the story of my life. But I wanted to be different, and I picked Toronto because I didn't want to just agree with Bink the entire time or most of the time. But I said that Atlanta was the better team. I've been saying that, we have been saying that for at least the last month or so. They proved it. Like, I'm not picking against Atlanta.
Yeah.
Like, even we could have the same exact picks. I'm not picking against Atlanta, at least until they give me a really, really good reason not to. But yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts or if you just want to shower FaZe with praise, because that's kind of this is kind of like the Atlanta FaZe podcast at times over the last few years. But this was a good example of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of good quotes out of this. Octane in particular saying it's a 1-team league now. Parasite, what exactly did he say? It was something essentially a little less dramatic than Octane. Yeah, he goes, FaZe and Optic are the 2 best teams in the league right now. I don't know what happened in New York and Toronto, but they got a lot to figure out. What am I watching? And I think on the broadcast or other people on Twitter were kind of making the comparison to like Cold War FaZe here. It seems like FaZe is just hitting stride. Obviously, they make the roster change to bring Draza in, and maybe it just took a little bit or a couple months to get the feel for playing with Draza and figuring all that out. But it seems like they're definitely just I don't want to say they're final boss for him yet, but if they aren't, they're definitely getting close there if they keep on performing the way they have been, and that's got to be scary for the rest of the teams in the league. So just a really strong performance. Obviously, there was the beef between Scrap and Draza heading into this one. It didn't honestly live up to the hype as much. Draza was a little more tame than I expected. Obviously, he was shouting into his camera right after the match ended. And then in the post game interview, Bucket actually just asked him like, "What are you going to tweet when you get out of this interview?" And he was basically just like, "Yeah, I'm gonna tell Scrappy maybe talk shit to the other teams not in the top 4 before you start talking shit to us." And I thought that was good, but I thought it could have been a little spicier. But end of the day, he really could have said whatever he wanted after that performance. It was a really strong series out of FaZe. That just shows that they are the undisputed best team in the game right now.
So they lost twice, Atlanta did, to Toronto at Major 1. Again, in the winners finals and in the grand finals, they went 2-7 in map count to Toronto in that tournament. Since then, they are 11-2. They lost only one Major 2 qualifying match, or they lost two Major 2 qualifying matches, both of them game 5s. And they have not lost any other match. They went undefeated at Major 2 so far. Obviously, it's only 2 weeks. They're actually 12-2. Excuse me. But they've only had 3 matches in the Major 3 qualifiers. But they've beaten Optic and now Toronto in the qualifiers. Of course, they beat Optic twice at Major 2. They beat New York. So they've now dominated every one of the top 4 teams in the last 3 weeks or last 4 weeks. They are the best team. It is undisputed, undeniable. And Optic is, I don't want to say like a super distant second because they have given FaZe like a run for their money in terms of like individual maps. But FaZe has been like, they haven't went to a map 5 against Optic so far this season as far as they actually the first major they went to a map 5, but other than that they've won 5 matches, lost 0. Most of the times been 3-0 or 3-1. They beat them 7-2 in Major 2. So FaZe is just the best. Optic is certainly number 2 at this point. And I would probably give Toronto an edge over New York just because New York had such a bad weekend, but neither one of those teams have looked particularly good lately.
All I want to say, just because I just thought of it, is this really all started after that LAG win over Atlanta. So maybe that was truly the catalyst to, allow Atlanta, because they haven't lost since that win or since that loss to LAG, I don't think. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe shout out LAG for, I remember distinctly in Cold War, we were talking about it. It was like before they officially brought in Tupac. It was on Express S&D. FaZe lost to LAG when it was like Silly, Apathy, and like the former EG guys. And like after that point on, they brought in Tupac and they like completely flipped the script in S&D, and obviously they go on a run after that and were a really strong team in Cold War. Maybe there's just a connection there between the LAG loss being what kicks things off for Final Form Atlanta. I'm still not ready to fully say they're Final Form because I still think obviously they're playing really well and they're the best team, but I think what's scary is they could get even better.
Yeah. I mean, you think about it, if you lose to LAG online, like that is the ultimate wake up call. That is rock bottom. That's when, your friends have the intervention for you and you really need to figure out life after that. And that's basically what FaZe has been doing. They did have a few tough matches at Major 2, but they have looked incredible. I'm really glad I wrote that article about Simp and Abizi when I did, because Simp said he literally said, I think we're just going to keep getting better. Like, I don't think we're, peaking yet. And I mean, it looks like he was very prophetic with that statement. And I expect them to get better. I mean, it was very impressive to see what happened in Cold War. Like that that entire season, I was just like, there's no way. Like in the back of my mind, I'm like, there's no way that they're gonna like just dominate to this degree. Like this just doesn't happen super often where a team completely runs away from everybody else. But they did, and they might do it again. We thought it was going to be really top four heavy, and it was going to be a dogfight between those top four. But right now, it's like there's one really big, strong dog, and then there are three other ones that they're tough compared to the rest. But when it gets when it's time to play FaZe, those three teams have not really shown up to the level that I definitely thought they would. But that might just be a testament to FaZe and not necessarily like anything about those other teams. But we'll see what happens as the season progresses. We do have another week of qualifying matches to talk about, and we'll give our predictions for. So there are 8 matches this week. There were 9 last. We're starting on Friday, April 26th. Only 2 matches. 2 kind of like we'll see what happens. Like there's no real. I guess it's better when we have just like the bottom 8 teams play each other, and then the top 4 teams play each other, because I feel like that's when we really get the competitive stuff. But the Friday, April 26th, Carolina plays LAT and LAG plays Minnesota. Carolina just went 2-0. LAT, they look decent as well. Who do you got in this match? It's kind of a tough matchup.
I gotta go with Carolina. I'm putting a little more stock in their recent win over New York. The whole being in the same facility or area thing. So yeah, give me Carolina.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Carolina as well because LAT beat Miami, and I'm not really sure what's even making Miami at this point. So I don't really know if I can give LAT a ton of credit for that win. Carolina's victories definitely seemed, at least one of them. Maybe the LAG one shouldn't count either, but the New York one definitely is a good sign of things to come. Hopefully for the Royal Ravens. LAG versus Minnesota. There's no way I'm picking LAG online, so the Rocker.
Well, I'm gonna let you revisit that sentence in a second, but I'm gonna take Minnesota here.
No, because I refuse to pick LAG online right now. It's the anti-FaZe. They have to give me a reason to pick against them or pick them. In this case, Saturday, April 27th, first matchup of the day, LAG versus the Boston Breach. I'm Ryan with Snoopy. I'm
All right.
I'm into the Breach or whatever their hashtag is.
I'm going with LAG. This is one I really don't want to pick either team, but yeah, give me LAG, I guess. I'm just not convinced by Boston yet.
Toronto versus Carolina. Toronto obviously coming off of a really dominant 3-0 loss. Carolina coming off of a 2-0 week. Potentially their third straight win if they end up toppling LAT on Friday. But I'm not going to pick. Right? Yeah. But I'm not going to pick Carolina. That's a bridge too far right now.
Yep. I'm going with Toronto too, but definitely going with the caveat, especially after the New York win, that this is another one. If Carolina shows up the way they played this past week and Toronto shows up the way they played against FaZe, then this could be one Carolina takes. But again, saying Toronto showing up the way they play against the best team in the game, that's not really being super fair to Toronto. But yeah, I'm going to take Toronto, but this is one I'm definitely excited to watch because if Carolina wins this, then I'm really excited for what they're building and doing for the rest of the year.
Last match on Saturday, Minnesota versus LAT. I'm going to go with the Thieves. I'm not confident at all in either one of these teams as well.
I'm going to go with Minnesota, but yeah, this is one I'm not super sold on either team.
Sunday, April 28th, Seattle versus Vegas. I'll go with Vegas, but I'm just thinking like their roster I think is really like it's good. Like it is a good roster. But we're really on a wait to see with ASIM in this roster and how they're gonna mesh. So I'll go with Vegas, but it's whatever.
I'm taking Vegas too, and I think obviously before this past week, this is Vegas no-brainer 10 out of 10 times, but Seattle beating New York just has to mean something, whether it means New York is getting worse or Seattle's getting better. I don't know what that actually is, or it could just be a total fluke. But regardless, I mean, that the Seattle win over New York has me at least thinking about this match more than I probably would have beforehand. Still going to go with Vegas, though.
I mean, there's a really good chance that both of the teams that beat New York this last week or whatever today, that they will lose their matches next week. Carolina, obviously they have 2 matches, but one of them is against Toronto. The other is against LAT. Neither of those are easy matches, and Seattle plays Vegas, and that's not an easy matchup for Seattle either. So that would be a really weird turn of events, and probably good for New York and all things considered, even though we'll get to it. But they don't have an easy road either. Optic versus Miami, it's obviously Optic. There's no way that either one of us can pick the Heretics.
Yeah, can't. Not even going with the whole Florida Miami versus
dead.
Optic thing. Yeah, no, just going with Optic. Not even thinking about it.
I mean, if Miami were to win, then we can revisit, whether Real is tapped back into something and he's brought back the Florida curse or whatever. But at this moment, it is dead, and Optic seems like they should be able to roll to another victory. In the grand finale of next week's matches, Sunday, April 28th, final match, New York versus Atlanta. This definitely would seem like a even more intriguing matchup if New York had shown up this past week. But that also makes it pretty interesting, just because if New York is able to win this match, then what? What do we really make of the subliners? Like, it's easier to kind of like write them off or to like expect them to lose. But if they are somehow able to beat FaZe, I think that would be a really big, obviously a big surprise, but kind of a big shakeup with CDL and kind of where I view them right now. But I'm going to go with FaZe. There's no reason to pick against them.
FaZe up, and like you said, not picking against them.
So our pick 'em right now. So we're tied on the season, 91 and 46. So I had like an early season lead. I think it was Major 1 that I did really well at, but I really haven't had too hot of a streak lately. I went 5-4 this week. You went 7-2. So we're both 91 and 46 on the year. Trimmer,
pretty damn good record for both of us.
Yeah. What is the 91 plus or divided by, what is that? 46 plus 91. My math is not mathing. So we're on a 66.4% win percentage on our picks, which is good. Like, especially with how competitive these bottom 8 teams are, or like inconsistent really is probably the better word for them. That we're not getting all of the picks wrong, because I picked Toronto versus Atlanta aside, I picked Boston over Minnesota. That didn't work. Obviously, we both got the New York picks wrong. So it's the CDL. Anything can really happen in these matches.
Just for reference, because the desk has been keeping up on the season. Puckett's 82 and 54. Well, this is before Atlanta,
Major.
Toronto.
Yeah.
Because Nameless is 90 and 46. I think he picks FaZe here, so he would technically be 91 and 46 like us. But Puckett's 82 and 54. He picked Toronto, so I think 82 and 55. And Alley would be 87 and 50. And then the fans are 21 and 29. So that's like we're doing better than we're doing a pretty good job. I'm gonna give us some props there.
We have former COD pros intellect when it comes to picking these. So if you're a betting man or a betting woman, then I'm not saying follow what we're doing, but I'm saying we're not like Jonte Porter or anything. We're really we're picking up. We're 66%. That's a good percentage. So if you want to follow our advice or our picks, then you probably don't follow Trimmers. He hasn't been too hot this season, but he'll figure it out. Probably not, but that about does it. This is a longer episode. We obviously were talking about the very fate of the Call of Duty League, which that seemed like something that we should spend a little more time on than usual. And that's not going to be an every week thing. Hopefully, I don't think they need to send out a state of the Call of Duty League after each week, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, thank you guys for listening or watching. Subscribe on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, all that good stuff. We'll be back next week, probably next Sunday to do the live show, possibly earlier next week, so like Monday or Tuesday, if not. And you can follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, at Ego Chall Podcast. And yeah, Bink, take it away.
Yeah, I already talked enough. So thank you guys as always for all the support. We appreciate it. We'll see you back here next week when we're here. And remember, send the chow.